The first time I realized something was wrong wasn't when the letter showed up on my doorstep. It was weeks earlier when my porch light started flickering at exactly midnight. Every night. Same time, same rhythm, like someone was testing it, watching. At first, I blamed the wiring. Old houses do that. But then came the footprints, muddy, deliberate, leading right up to my door, stopping at the welcome mat, never turning back. I cleaned them one morning before work, and by the time I returned, they were there again. Same size, same spacing, only deeper. It wasn't until I checked the security camera that I felt my stomach twist. The feed cut out every time the motion sensor triggered. No faces, no movement, just static. And right before the screen went black, a faint sound, a key sliding into metal. That's when I started sleeping in the living room. Our neighborhood was supposed to be safe, quiet, manicured, predictable. Every mailbox matched, every trash bin color-coded, every lawn trimmed to regulation height. That's what the HOA was proud of, control. And I'd always played by their rules, paid my dues, kept my head down. But the thing about control is, once people taste it, they always want more. The letters began as friendly reminders. Repaint your shutters, trim your hedges, move your car. Then they turned colder. Demands, warnings, fines, and when I didn't respond fast enough, things started disappearing. First my mailbox, then my security sign, then the spare key from under the mat. That was when I knew it wasn't random. Someone in this neighborhood wanted me gone. Someone with access. Someone who thought the HOA's rules gave them permission to cross a line that should never be crossed. And they did. Because one night, I heard my front door unlock, softly, slowly, like whoever was on the other side belonged there. I waited, heartbeat thundering, as the handle turned just an inch, and then stopped. They didn't know it yet. But they had just walked into a trap. What followed would tear this perfect little neighborhood apart and expose secrets that were never meant to be found. So tell me, how far would you go to protect your home when the people trying to take it from you live right next door? I moved to Willow Creek because it seemed like the kind of place where nothing bad could ever happen. A neat little pocket of suburbia tucked between rolling hills and a shimmering man-made lake. The neighborhood looked like something lifted straight from a postcard. Rows of identical mailboxes, freshly paved driveways, children's bicycles leaning against white fences. Every front yard looked like it had been trimmed with surgical precision, each blade of grass standing obediently in line. The streets had names like Sycamore Bend and Whispering Oaks, designed to sound poetic enough to disguise the fact that this was, at its core, a gated world of silent competition and smiling judgment. When I first moved in, I thought it was perfect. I'd just come off a long stretch of overwork and needed somewhere calm, somewhere I could raise my son without worrying about noise, traffic, or chaos. Willow Creek offered that illusion, peace wrapped in perfection. My townhouse sat at the end of a quiet cul-de-sac shaded by 2 oak trees that dropped acorns all summer long. It wasn't grand, but it was ours. The walls were warm, the garden small but green, and the air always smelled faintly of jasmine from Mrs. Dwyer's flower beds next door. My son, Caleb, took to it immediately. He was 13, quick-witted, the kind of kid who liked puzzles and taking things apart just to see how they worked. He spent most evenings on the porch tinkering with his little drone, sending it humming lazily above the rooftops while I read on the steps. Those first few months felt like the beginning of something steady. After years of apartment living, the space and quiet felt like a reward. But peace in Willow Creek came with conditions, written and unwritten. The Homeowners Association, or HOA, was the real government here. They controlled everything, what color your shutters could be, how tall your grass was allowed to grow, even the kind of mailbox flag you could install. Most of the residents went along with it. They said it was the price of maintaining community standards, but I soon learned that those standards were less. About beauty and more about control. The HOA board met every first Thursday of the month in the clubhouse, a bland beige building, at the center of the development that smelled, faintly of coffee and air freshener. The meetings were technically open to all residents, but few attended. The board made sure of that, burying decisions in bureaucratic language and presenting everything as routine maintenance. On paper, they were volunteers. In practice, they were rulers. At the top of that small hierarchy sat Mrs. Dalton, or as most neighbors called her behind closed doors, Madam President. She was short, sturdy, and perpetually overdressed, always in pearls, even when taking out the trash. Her hair was wound into a tight bun that seemed to pull her entire face upward into a permanent expression of authority. She carried herself like a woman born to give orders. You could hear her before you saw her, her voice clipped and sharp, as if every sentence were an announcement. To outsiders, she was the image of civic responsibility. To those who lived here, she was a storm in beige heels. Then there was Mr. Briggs, the vice president, a man who treated the HOA bylaws like sacred scripture. A retired insurance adjuster, he found new purpose in enforcing what he called property discipline. He kept a clipboard wherever he went, jotting down license plate numbers, paint shades, or any grass patch that dared grow half an inch too tall. He and Mrs. Dalton were an unholy alliance. Her appetite for control fed perfectly into his obsession with order. Ms. Avery, the treasurer, was quieter but no less dangerous. She ran the HOA's books and wielded fines like weapons. If Mrs. Dalton was the face of power, Avery was its shadow, the one who sent the emails, drafted the warnings, and always made sure the board's hands looked clean. Her smile never reached her eyes, and her words always ended with a per-hour bylaws clause. And finally, Mr. Klein, the newest member, handled community relations. He was the friendly one, or pretended to be. He'd walk the neighborhood with a coffee in hand, greeting everyone, collecting gossip disguised as concerns, and funneling it all back to Mrs. Dalton. If you complained about him, he'd act hurt, insist you'd misunderstood his intentions. It was always the same pattern: charm, compliance, and then a strike when you least expected it. It didn't take long for me to see how the system worked. The board members didn't enforce rules equally. They enforced them selectively. People they liked got reminders. People they didn't got warnings. And once you were on their list, it was almost impossible to get off. The first red flag came about a month after I moved in. I'd left my trash bin out a little longer than usual, less than an hour past collection. The next morning, a neatly printed notice was taped to my door: violation number 113, improper waste container visibility. It wasn't a fine, just a warning, but the message was clear. Someone had noticed. Someone was watching. A week later, I received another notice, this time for excessive foliage near the property line. My shrubs apparently had grown 2 inches beyond the limit. I trimmed them immediately, but it didn't matter. The letter had already been sent. When I attended my first HOA meeting to ask about the citations, Mrs. Dalton greeted me like a headmistress addressing a misbehaving student. Her smile was polite but cold. She assured me that these things happen, and that residents who quickly correct issues rarely have further problems. Her tone was syrupy, but her eyes said something else. "We're watching you." The other attendees, maybe a dozen neighbors, sat quietly, nodding along to her words like a congregation too afraid to interrupt their pastor. I realized then that in Willow Creek, silence was a form of survival. Over the next few weeks, life resumed its artificial calm. I worked from home, kept the yard neat, helped Caleb with his summer projects. We were cautious but not paranoid. Not yet. Then came the night the motion sensor light flickered on. It was just past midnight. The streets were empty, no cars, no sounds except the steady buzz of crickets. The light on the porch flared to life for a second, then went dark. I glanced through the blinds. Nothing, just the quiet stillness of a perfect suburban night. But when I stepped outside the next morning, there were faint scuff marks near the doormat, as if someone had turned the mat over. It didn't seem worth panicking about. Not then. A few days later, Mrs. Dalton stopped by unexpectedly. She said she was conducting routine safety checks. She stood on my porch, her hands clasped neatly in front of her, and complimented my landscaping before subtly glancing past me into the house. "It's good to see you're taking care of things," she said. "Not everyone in the neighborhood respects the standards we try to uphold." I wanted to ask if that meant she'd been the one inspecting my shrubs, but something in her tone made me hold back. She left as quickly as she came, her heels clicking against the walkway, leaving behind the faint smell of her perfume and a heavier air than before. After that, I started noticing how the HOA's presence seeped into every corner of the neighborhood. Their emails, their patrols, their constant reminders about community harmony. It wasn't just about lawns and mailboxes anymore. It was about obedience. Caleb, ever observant, picked up on it too. One afternoon, as we were repainting the mailbox to match the approved color, he asked why grown adults cared so much about what shade of blue it was. I told him it was about keeping things uniform, but even as I said it, the words felt hollow. Around that same time, a rumor began circulating that Mrs. Dalton had keys, not just to the clubhouse or the storage shed, but to people's homes. Supposedly, years ago during a security initiative, some residents had given her spare keys for emergencies. Over time, others claimed she made copies. No one could prove it, but everyone whispered it. And everyone made sure to double-check their locks. Then came the neighborhood BBQ, the one event every resident was expected to attend. Attendance wasn't technically mandatory, but if you skipped it, your name somehow ended up mentioned at the next meeting. I went mostly for Caleb's sake. It was a sunny Saturday afternoon, kids splashing in the community pool, adults clustered around tables covered in identical store-bought salads. Mrs. Dalton presided over it like royalty, greeting each guest with that same too-wide smile. Mr. Briggs floated nearby, clipboard tucked discreetly under one arm, while Ms. Avery handled sign-ins, taking mental notes of who brought what dish and who didn't contribute. Noticed how the conversation always turned to subtle judgments, whose lawn looked a little patchy, whose garage door needed repainting, whose teenager seemed a bit wild lately. It was gossip wrapped in concern, and beneath it all ran an undercurrent of fear. As the sun dipped and the crowd thinned, Mrs. Dalton made her rounds one last time. When she reached me, she leaned in slightly and said, "It's good to see you settling in. We like responsible homeowners here. You strike me as someone who values order." I nodded politely, but her words left a strange aftertaste. That night, Caleb asked why she'd stared at the front door as she said goodbye. I hadn't noticed, but he had. In the days that followed, small things began to shift. A misplaced package, the recycling bin found open, the faint sense of being observed, even when no one was there. The security light flickered again, and again I found those footprints. The HOA's next letter arrived on a Monday. It cited me for failure to maintain decorative harmony. The reason? My porch mat, the same one that had been there since the day I moved in, was deemed inconsistent with community aesthetic standards. I almost laughed, but Caleb looked at me seriously. "She's testing you," he said. "She wants to see how far you'll go before you push back." He wasn't wrong. By now, the neighborhood had taken on a different atmosphere. Conversations stopped when I walked by. Neighbors waved less, smiled less. It was as if a silent warning had been issued. I began noticing how the board members patrolled the streets, not together, but separately, at odd hours. Mrs. Dalton on her morning walks, Mr. Briggs with his clipboard near dusk, Ms. Avery pausing by coincidence near our mailbox. Caleb started documenting everything. He said it was for fun, just an experiment, he called it, but I knew better. He was collecting evidence, small bits and pieces, photos, timestamps, anything that might make sense later. I still remember the night that sealed it, the night when I heard the sound of a key turning in my lock. That was when the illusion of safety shattered completely. But before that moment, before the horn, the camera, the fallout, there was this fragile in-between. The quiet dread before a storm. The sense that something in Willow Creek was not as pristine as it pretended to be. In hindsight, the signs were everywhere. The way Mrs. Dalton lingered too long near the mailboxes. The way her car always seemed to pass our street just after dark. The way Mr. Briggs smiled whenever someone received a fine. The neighborhood wasn't peaceful. It was controlled. And the longer we lived there, the tighter that control wrapped around us. Back then, I still believed that following the rules would keep us safe. That reason would win over obsession. That decency mattered. I had no idea how wrong I was, Because when someone believes they own the neighborhood, they stop seeing boundaries. And when power hides behind politeness, it's already too late. And somewhere between those quiet nights and the first twist of that key in my door, Willow Creek stopped feeling like home and started feeling like a trap waiting to be sprung. It started with the fines. Small ones at first, the kind meant to seem harmless, even reasonable. A $25 penalty for leaving the recycling bin visible past noon. Then $50 for unapproved exterior decorations, which, as it turned out, meant the wind chime Caleb had hung on the porch. When I tried to appeal the charges, the HOA board denied it within 24 hours. Per Section 3, Clause B of the Community Standards Agreement, the email read, decorative items producing sound are not permitted on front-facing structures. Sound. They had a rule against sound. By the end of that week, 2 more warnings appeared. The mailbox paint was fading, and my grass was uneven by 1.5 inches. It was ridiculous, but every letter carried that same cold tone, the tone that said they weren't asking, they were documenting. Each envelope arrived crisp, almost ceremonious, sealed with the HOA's gold crest, like a declaration of war dressed up as civility. I knew better than to fight every fine. That's how they got you. They wanted pushback. They wanted an excuse to mark your file as uncooperative. But it was hard not to react when the absurdity kept piling on. Caleb called it bureaucratic bullying. He wasn't wrong. One morning I found Mrs. Dalton standing across the street, speaking quietly to a man I didn't recognize. She gestured toward my yard, her manicured fingers slicing the air as she spoke. The man nodded, took photos, then drove off in a white sedan with the HOA logo on the side. Later, I learned he was their compliance inspector, a retired police officer hired to ensure community integrity. He began patrolling the neighborhood twice a week, clipboard in hand. Like we were living under surveillance, the notices became weekly, then daily. $75 for faded mulch, $100 for structural disharmony because my porch light wasn't the same model as my neighbor's. At first, I thought it was personal, that Mrs. Dalton had singled me out. But as Caleb began quietly asking around, we discovered others had their own stories. Across the street, Mr. Chin got fined for unapproved plant placement. His offense? Planting basil instead of ornamental ivy. Down the road, a young couple was cited for parking their second car in the guest lot too frequently. It was clear the board's grip had tightened on everyone. But while others bent under pressure, most refused to speak out. "It's easier to pay than fight," one neighbor whispered to me. Fear had become the HOA's greatest tool. Then, the letters changed tone. Immediate compliance required. Failure to respond will result in further action. Your standing in the community may be reconsidered. That last one chilled me. Standing wasn't an official term. It was a threat wrapped in politeness. It meant they could suspend your access to shared amenities, bar you from meetings, even push for legal measures if they deemed you a detriment to neighborhood harmony. Caleb began documenting every interaction, time-stamped photos of the letters, videos of Mrs. Dalton's car cruising past our house at odd hours, screenshots of every email. It became his project, a mix of detective work and quiet rebellion. I let him, partly to keep him busy, partly because a growing part of me knew we'd need evidence. The turning point came one humid afternoon in July. I was working from home when a knock rattled the door. Standing there was Mrs. Dalton, flanked by Mr. Briggs and their so-called compliance officer. She smiled, that smile she used when she was about to deliver bad news disguised as help. "We've received several complaints," she said, stepping onto my porch without waiting for an invitation. "There's been concern about the condition of your property." I looked around. The yard was immaculate. Caleb had mowed it 2 days ago. The paint was fresh. There wasn't a single leaf out of place. "What condition?" I asked. She gestured toward the side fence. It's warped." The fence was fine, a small bow from the summer heat at most. I opened my mouth to argue, but Mr. Briggs was already scribbling on his clipboard. "Structural inconsistency," he muttered. "I'll fix it," I said tightly. Mrs. Dalton nodded, satisfied. "Excellent. We'll check again in 72 hours. They left without another word, their heels clicking in perfect rhythm. I stood in the doorway, heat simmering under my skin. Caleb appeared behind me, his voice quiet. You know she's not checking the fence. She's checking you. He was right. That night, the motion light flickered again. Then the next night, and the next. I started waking up to faint noises, the crunch of gravel, the low hum of a car engine idling nearby. One evening, I peered through the blinds and caught the faint reflection of headlights pulling away. The next morning, another notice, failure to address fence issue, $150 fine. The timestamp showed they'd inspected the property at 2:18 a.m. That was when I realized it wasn't about rules anymore. It was psychological warfare. Things escalated fast. The HOA installed new security cameras around the neighborhood, small black domes mounted on lamp posts. Mrs. Dalton announced it as a safety upgrade, but the cameras always seemed to point toward certain houses, mine included. A week later, I received another letter. Unauthorized surveillance equipment detected on your property. Remove immediately. They were referring to the tiny camera Caleb had hidden in our birdhouse. It was absurd. They'd installed their own surveillance, yet accused me of spying. I tried to reason with them through email, but their replies grew increasingly hostile. They cited privacy violations, implied I was recording neighbors without consent. That night, Caleb found one of the birdhouse's screws loosened, like someone had tampered with it. He said nothing, but I saw his jaw tighten. That same quiet fury I'd seen in my own reflection. Then came the special inspection. A bright yellow notice arrived, stating that due to ongoing concerns about maintenance compliance, the HOA would conduct a full property walkthrough. No date, no consent form, just a statement. Failure to cooperate will result in legal escalation. I called the HOA office, demanded clarification, but Ms. Avery's voice on the other end was calm and cold. It's in accordance with Section 7.2 of the HOA Charter, she said. If you have nothing to hide, there's no issue. The phrase stuck with me. If you have nothing to hide, Caleb was furious. They can't do that, Dad. That's trespassing. He was right, but they were counting on fear to keep us silent. For a while I thought it might blow over. I fixed the fence, repainted the shutters, even swapped out the porch light to match the approved model. The letters slowed, but the tension didn't. Neighbors avoided eye contact. Conversations stopped when I approached. I overheard Mrs. Dalton once tell another resident, "Some homeowners just don't fit the community spirit." Then, one morning, Caleb burst into the kitchen, tablet in hand. You have to see this. It was footage from our remaining hidden camera, the one facing the side gate. The timestamp showed 6:43 a.m. The video was grainy, but clear enough to make out Mrs. Dalton stepping into our yard, clipboard in hand, glancing around before disappearing from the frame. 30 seconds later, she re-emerged, locking the gate behind her. My hands shook. She'd entered our property. No notice, no consent. We could have called the police, but what would we say? The HOA president broke in to check our fence? They'd call it a misunderstanding. Mrs. Dalton knew that. She operated in that gray space where legality blurred with intimidation. Instead, Caleb suggested something else, proof that couldn't be denied. He wanted to set her up again, like the air horn trap we'd used once before. I hesitated, but he was determined. We spent that weekend upgrading the cameras, hiding them better, syncing the footage to a cloud drive she couldn't touch. Days passed in uneasy quiet. Then another letter appeared. This time, hand-delivered. Due to repeated noncompliance and disruptive behavior, your property will be subject to review for possible lien placement. They were threatening to take my home. That night, as I sat at the kitchen table reading the letter for the 10th time, I heard the faint creak of the front gate. Caleb, upstairs, sent a text. "She's here." I pulled up the camera feed. Mrs. Dalton was standing on the porch again, brass key in hand, looking around before leaning toward the lock. My pulse pounded in my ears. She twisted the key down and the horn blared, louder than before. She stumbled back, clutching her chest as papers flew everywhere. Caleb's laughter echoed faintly from upstairs. "I got her again," he whispered. But this time, it wasn't just for satisfaction. The footage was clear as her face, the key, the act. Irrefutable evidence. The next morning, I sent it to the HOA board. No message, no commentary, just the video. Hours later, my inbox exploded. First came an automatic acknowledgement, then silence. Then, finally, a response from Ms. Avery. The board will review this matter internally. Please refrain from distributing the footage further until an official determination has been made. By evening, Mrs. Dalton's car was gone. The next day, she returned, not to apologize, but to retaliate. I found a new notice taped to my door, unauthorized modifications detected. Potential violation of privacy ordinances. She was accusing me of spying again, using the evidence of her own misconduct as justification. The following week was chaos. Anonymous complaints started flooding the HOA portal. Noise disturbances, unapproved technology, possible surveillance of minors. Each one fabricated, but each triggering another inspection threat. Someone even left a typed note in my mailbox. You don't belong here. The isolation deepened. Friends who once waved now turned away. The HOA had built its own narrative. I was the troublemaker, the man disrupting their perfect community. Mrs. Dalton had weaponized perception itself, but Caleb wasn't giving up. He dug through the HOA's publicly posted bylaws and found something buried deep in the fine print. Section 9.3, any officer found acting outside the scope of authorized duties is subject to immediate suspension pending review. All we needed was the right trigger. Undeniable. Proof that the board had collectively participated in misconduct. That opportunity came sooner than expected. Late one evening, Caleb noticed the HOA's shared Google Drive, the one hosting meeting minutes, had a temporary public link. Inside were drafts of internal memos. One in particular caught our eye. Action plan, non-compliant homeowners. It listed names, including mine, alongside notes about behavioral observation, entry attempts, and escalation schedule. It even detailed the fines, pre-written before any inspections occurred. They weren't enforcing rules. They were running a campaign. Caleb backed up every file before the link vanished. He looked at me and said, "We have them." But exposure wouldn't be easy. The HOA's next meeting was scheduled for Thursday, and rumor had it, Mrs. Dalton planned to introduce a motion for community security upgrades, a cover for more surveillance. If we wanted to stop her, it had to be there. Public, undeniable, and irreversible. The days leading up to that meeting felt like walking through glass. Every car that passed felt suspicious. Every rustle outside made me tense. I slept with the porch light on, but it didn't help. One night, Caleb swore he saw someone standing by the mailbox, just out of the light's reach. By the time I checked, they were gone. Then, on Wednesday morning, a final envelope appeared. No gold seal this time, just plain paper. Inside, a single line typed in bold, "Last warning. Withdraw your accusations or face legal action for defamation." They knew. But what they didn't know was that by the next evening, their power would crumble in front of everyone. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse was packed. More residents than I'd ever seen before, drawn by curiosity, whispers, fear. Mrs. Dalton stood at the front, radiant in her false confidence, calling the gathering to order. Mr. Briggs sat beside her, pen poised. When she began speaking about community harmony, I felt Caleb's elbow nudge mine. It was time. He connected his tablet to the projector. The lights dimmed. The screen came to life, first with footage of her unlocking our door, then the internal HOA documents. Gasps filled the room. A neighbor in the front row whispered, "She did have keys." Mrs. Dalton froze. For the first time since I'd moved to Willow Creek, she looked small, cornered. But the fallout, the real fallout, was still to come, because what Caleb and I didn't yet know was that Mrs. Dalton had one last card to play. Something hidden deep in the HOA's charter that would turn the entire neighborhood against itself before it was over. And as the murmurs turned to shouting, as the board scrambled to regain control, I realized something that chilled me more than anything she'd done so far. She wasn't afraid of losing power. She was afraid of what losing it would reveal, and the closer we got to the truth, the more dangerous she became. The The meeting ended in chaos. The footage had played twice, once by accident, once by demand, and when the lights came back on, Mrs. Dalton's face was drained of color. The board scrambled to recover, mumbling about context, about misinterpretation. But the damage was done. Neighbors murmured in disbelief, and for the first time, her control wavered. But she didn't back down. She stood there, trembling with fury and humiliation, and said, "This footage was obtained illegally. It violates community privacy standards. This homeowner," she pointed at me, her hand shaking, "has endangered every resident here. He's a threat to our peace." The room went silent. It wasn't defense. It was desperation. That night, the HOA sent an emergency notice, a motion for immediate suspension of my membership rights. My pool key deactivated, my clubhouse access revoked. It was punishment without due process, a final grasp at authority. Caleb said to let it go, to wait until the board imploded on its own. But I knew Mrs. Dalton too well. She'd never let go quietly. The next morning, the world felt different. People stared as I drove by. Someone had taped flyers to stop signs. "Beware of the homeowner who spies on neighbors." Fake, unsigned, but effective. Caleb tore one down, furious. I told him to leave it. "They're scared," I said. "She's feeding that fear." But even fear has a breaking point. That evening I received an email from someone anonymous. Subject line, "You should see this." It contained a single attachment, a PDF of the HOA's financial records. At first glance it looked routine, but buried halfway through was a section marked Discretionary Security Fund. Thousands of dollars funneled to external consultants, all signed off by Mrs. Dalton and Mr. Briggs, the same. Consultants who had supposedly installed those neighborhood cameras, except those cameras didn't belong to the HOA at all. The invoice came from a private surveillance company that specialized in monitoring residents under dispute. They hadn't just watched me, they'd watched everyone. The next HOA meeting was supposed to be routine. Mrs. Dalton had scheduled it for the following week, likely to rebuild control and spin the story her way. I knew that was my only chance to end this, not just for me, but for every neighbor who'd been too afraid to fight back. Caleb helped me prepare. We printed every record, time-stamped every email, organized the video clips into a seamless timeline. For 2 days straight, the living room became a war room. We weren't just defending ourselves anymore. We were exposing an empire built on fear. Then, 2 nights before the meeting, something happened that made my blood run cold. At exactly 2:37 a.m., the front door rattled. I shot up in bed, heart hammering. Caleb was already awake. We crept to the window and saw shadows moving across the lawn. 2 figures, one tall, one shorter, carrying flashlights. The beams swept across the porch, then the garage. I grabbed my phone and started recording through the blinds. The shorter figure knelt near the door, fiddling with something. The porch light flicked on, and I saw her. Mrs. Dalton. She wasn't alone. Mr. Briggs stood behind her, clipboard in hand. The lock clicked. That sound, the soft metallic shift of the key, set something off in me. All the months of harassment, humiliation, the endless fines and threats, they condensed into one pure, electric moment of rage. I swung the door open, looking for something. Mrs. Dalton froze, her face illuminated by the porch light. For a heartbeat, no one spoke. Then she straightened, mask snapping back into place. "Routine inspection," she said calmly, like she wasn't breaking into my home in the middle of the night. "With a master key?" I asked. Mr. Briggs stepped forward. "We received complaints." "Stop!" I snapped. "You're trespassing. Both of you." Caleb appeared behind me, phone raised, recording every second. Mrs. Dalton's eyes darted to it. "Put that down," she hissed. "Why?" he said. "So you can rewrite the story later?" For the first time, her composure cracked. She lunged toward him, but I stepped between them. "You touch him, and I call the police," I said. "And this time I'll press charges." Her voice dropped to a whisper, sharp as glass. "You don't know who you're dealing with." "Oh, I think I do." I stepped aside and let Caleb speak. "We know about the discretionary fund," he said. "We know about the cameras, the fake complaints, the inspections. We have it all, Mrs. Dalton, every single file." Her face went pale. For a second, the only sound was the hum of the porch light. Then, without another word, she turned and walked away. Mr. Briggs followed, silent, his clipboard clutched like a shield. We didn't sleep that night. The house felt different, like the walls were listening, waiting. The next morning, we discovered that the HOA's email system had gone dark. The website was under maintenance. The meeting, however, was still on the calendar. And I knew this was it. The final reckoning? The clubhouse was overflowing when we arrived. Even the quietest neighbors were there, the ones who'd never spoken at meetings before. Mrs. Dalton sat at the front, flanked by the remaining board members. Her posture was perfect, smile unbroken, but her eyes betrayed her. She began the meeting with forced calm. "There have been disturbing accusations circulating in our community," she said, her voice trembling just slightly. "Tonight we'll address them with truth." Caleb leaned forward and whispered, "It's time." I stood. The room quieted. "Before you start rewriting history," I said, "I think everyone deserves to see what's really been happening." Without waiting for permission, Caleb connected his laptop to the projector. The lights dimmed and the screen came alive, emails, bank statements, memos. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Each slide peeled away another layer of the HOA's deception, the false inspections, the pre-written fines, the unauthorized cameras. Then came the video, Mrs. Dalton at my door, the key in her hand. Her face was illuminated larger than life on the wall behind her. She didn't move. When the lights came back on, the silence was deafening. "Do you deny it?" I asked. She opened her mouth, but no words came. Mr. Briggs shifted uncomfortably beside her. "There's been a misunderstanding," he said weakly. Caleb cut him off. "We downloaded your internal notes. You labeled homeowners as targets. You fined people before you even inspected their homes. You spied on us." Someone in the crowd stood up, a woman from 2 streets over. "They fined me for having a blue wreath," she said, voice trembling. "I paid it because they said they'd revoke my parking pass." Then another voice. "They told me to repaint my shutters 3 times in 1 year." The room erupted. Years of resentment boiled to the surface, stories, confessions, accusations. The illusion of control shattered in seconds. Mrs. Dalton tried to speak over the noise. "Order? We need order." But no one was listening. That's when I stepped forward, holding the final piece, the printed financial records, highlighted and tabbed. "This is where your HOA fees went," I said, lifting them high. "Private security contracts, personal reimbursements, vacations listed as board retreats. This isn't governance, it's theft." Her mask finally cracked. "You think you've won?" she hissed. "You have no idea what I can do." She reached for the microphone, but Caleb spoke first. "Actually," he said, voice calm, "we sent everything to the state HOA compliance division this morning." A murmur rippled through the room. "And," he added, "to the local news." Mrs. Dalton's hand froze midair. For a long moment, no one moved. Then she laughed, a sharp, brittle sound that didn't reach her eyes. "You think they'll believe you over me?" she said. "Over the president of a certified association? You're just another bitter homeowner who can't follow rules." But her voice wavered. Then came the sound that broke her, a neighbor from the back, clapping. Slow, deliberate, 1 clap at a time. Others joined. Within seconds, the entire room was applauding, not for her, but for the truth. Her smile faltered. Mr. Briggs gathered his papers, avoiding her gaze. 2 other board members slipped quietly out the side door. She stood there alone, frozen in the spotlight she'd built for herself. "This isn't over," she said softly, almost to herself. Then she turned and walked out, the door slamming behind her. The applause faded into silence. For a moment, no one spoke. Then the woman with the wreath whispered, "What happens now?" I didn't know yet, but the fear that had ruled this neighborhood for years had cracked. Over the next few days, the fallout was brutal. Emails poured in from residents demanding resignations. The HOA office was locked, its records seized by investigators. News crews appeared, interviewing homeowners about the tyrant of Willow Creek. The cameras that once watched us now watched her, splashing her face across headlines she could never control. But it wasn't over for us, either. The aftermath was messy. Lawyers, meetings, revisions to the bylaws. They tried to appoint an interim president, but no one volunteered. Trust had become radioactive. Then, One morning, a letter arrived, not from the HOA, but from the county clerk's office. The lien Mrs. Dalton had filed against my property had been voided. No legal basis, it read. I stood there for a long time, just staring at the paper. Caleb came up beside me. "It's over," he said. "Not yet," I murmured. Because a few days later, someone sent me another anonymous envelope. Inside was a single photo, Mrs. Dalton standing outside a different community clubhouse, shaking hands with a man in a suit. The caption printed underneath read, "New board president, Dalton. To restore harmony at Lakeside Ridge, she'd moved on. Started again." I looked at the photo for a long time before setting it down. Some battles, I realized, don't end with victory. They end with awareness, with the knowledge that power, once unchecked, always finds a new home. But for now, in Willow Creek, the silence was finally ours. No more notes on the door, no more cars idling at night. Just the hum of the cicadas and the sound of a neighborhood learning how to breathe again. And as I sat on the porch that evening, Caleb beside me, the air felt lighter somehow, like justice didn't erase the scars, but it made them worth carrying. She thought she'd broken us. But what she didn't understand was that you can't control people forever, not when they finally remember who really owns the keys. In the weeks that followed the meeting, the air in Willow Creek changed. You could feel it just by walking down the street. The silence that used to hang like a warning, neighbors whispering behind curtains, the dread of seeing a notice taped to your door, was gone. It was replaced with something lighter. Mrs. Dalton had been moving funds into a private account for years, disguised as community maintenance and beautification initiatives. Briggs had signed off on most of them. When investigators tracked the transactions, they led to personal purchases, travel, electronics, even a lease on a second car registered in another county. The news broke publicly within 48 hours. Local headlines read, "HOA president accused of fraud, faces legal investigation." Neighbors gathered outside the clubhouse to watch reporters swarm the property. Some were angry, others vindicated, but all of them seemed to breathe easier. The control that once suffocated this place was crumbling under its own arrogance. Caleb stood next to me, hands in his pockets, watching the scene. "Think she'll actually go to jail?" he asked. "Maybe," I said. "But even if she doesn't, she's already lost what she valued most, control." He smiled faintly. "Feels weird seeing everyone free." It did. For the first time in years, people started talking to each other again. Not just polite waves across the lawn, real conversations. Neighbors who used to avoid eye contact now stopped by with coffee, swapping stories about fines and letters they'd kept out of fear. Someone started a petition to dissolve the HOA entirely. Within 3 days, it had over 100 signatures, but not everyone was eager to burn it all down. Some wanted reform, a system that worked for the people instead of against them. A few of the more level-headed neighbors formed a temporary committee. They knocked on doors asking what residents wanted in a new charter. It wasn't about power anymore. It was about rebuilding trust. I kept my distance, not out of bitterness, but because I finally understood something. Some fights don't need to be prolonged. Sometimes the win isn't in the structure you destroy, but in the peace you reclaim. Still, the past had a way of echoing. One morning I found a small envelope wedged into my mailbox. No stamp, no address, just my name in neat, looping handwriting. Inside was a single brass key, the same kind she'd used on my lock. Attached to it was a note written on lined paper. "Every lock opens to someone. Be careful who you let hold the next one." No signature, but I didn't need one. I turned the key over in my hand, half expecting to feel anger. Instead, I felt something else, closure. I slipped it into a drawer and never mentioned it again. The weeks became months. The HOA was formally dissolved after a vote, 92% in favor. What was left of its budget was redistributed for real neighborhood needs: streetlights, park benches, playground repairs. For once, the money went where it should have all along. Mrs. Dalton's name faded from the community. New families moved in. Her house, once the biggest on the block, sat empty for a while, eventually sold to a young couple with 2 small kids. They painted the shutters a deep green, hung a swing from the oak tree, and filled the yard with laughter instead of rules. I can't say I didn't think about her sometimes. The image of her standing in front of that projector, her own power collapsing under the weight of truth, it stuck with me. Not out of pity, but as a reminder. Control can make good people cruel, and fear can make decent people silent. The story spread beyond our neighborhood. A local journalist turned it into a feature about HOA abuse of power. Soon emails poured in from people across the country, homeowners, tenants, small-town residents, each with their own version of a Mrs. Dalton. Each one thanked us for speaking up, for showing that even the smallest voices can make a difference when the truth comes out. Caleb took that to heart. He started studying law in college, saying he wanted to work in property and homeowner rights. If someone's going to read the fine print, he'd said with that same grin, it might as well be me. I was proud of him, not just because of what he'd done, but because of who he became through it. Watching him transform from a quiet, curious kid into someone who saw through manipulation, it made every sleepless night worth it. As for me, I started living again. The house didn't feel like a fortress anymore. I took up gardening, rebuilt the porch railing, even hosted a neighborhood barbecue. The laughter that once felt impossible now drifted freely between yards. But one afternoon, as I was trimming the hedges, I spotted a familiar car driving slowly down the street, a silver sedan. Clean, quiet, deliberate, it didn't stop, just rolled past the house and turned the corner for a split second. I thought I saw her profile behind the glass, chin lifted, eyes cold. But maybe it was just my imagination. Either way, it didn't matter. She couldn't hurt us anymore, not here, not now. Still, the image lingered long after the car disappeared. Because deep down, I knew this story wasn't just about one neighborhood, it was about power, and how easily people trade freedom for the illusion of order. How quickly we hand over our peace of mind to anyone who promises to protect it. Weeks later, the HOA signs were taken down, the bylaws shredded, the old meeting minutes thrown away. In their place, the neighbors voted to rename our little cul-de-sac. The sign went up on a bright Saturday morning, right at the entrance, Willow Creek Commons, a community, not a committee. Simple, but it said everything. That evening, as the sun dipped low and the air filled with the smell of barbecues and laughter, I sat on my porch again. Same chair, same view, different world. Caleb was home from college, sprawled on the steps, his dog curled at his feet. Across the street, kids played tag where Mrs. Dalton once scolded them for stepping on lawns. Someone's sprinkler misted the air, catching the light like silver threads. It felt quiet. The kind of quiet you don't notice until you realize how much noise used to live inside you. Caleb glanced over. Do you ever miss it? What, the HOA? I chuckled. He shrugged. Not them. The fight. I thought about it. The adrenaline, the tension, the feeling of standing up to something that had controlled us for too long. Sometimes, I said, but peace is harder. It takes effort to hold on to it, he nodded, eyes thoughtful. The next morning I walked out to the mailbox, habit routine, and found something unexpected. A letter from the county. The HOA fraud case was officially closed. All associated fines refunded. All liens cleared. Case settled. I stood there for a long time, the letter trembling in my hand. For the first time in months, I let myself breathe fully. The fight was really over. That night, as I looked out over the quiet neighborhood, I couldn't help but wonder about Mrs. Dalton. Was she somewhere else, starting over? Had she found another community to manage? Or did she finally look in the mirror and see what she'd become? Maybe that was the real punishment, not the legal one, but the slow, gnawing realization that her empire was built on fear. And fear doesn't last forever, she once said. You don't know who you're dealing with, but she was wrong. I knew exactly who she was. I'd just forgotten who I was for a while, until she reminded me. And maybe that's the strange gift buried inside every fight, like this. You think it's about rules, or property, or money, but it's really about power. About learning that no one can control your life unless you let them. That night, as the cicadas hummed and the stars blinked through the trees, I thought about how easily this all could have gone differently. How many times I almost gave in, almost signed the check, almost kept quiet. But then I thought of Caleb And the look in his eyes the day he said, "She'll try it again," and I realized something simple, something worth remembering. When someone tries to control your home, your peace, your life, you can fight back. You don't need permission, because at the end of the day, there's one truth that no bylaw, no committee, and no self-appointed ruler can ever erase. The home may sit on their map, but it will always belong to you. Now tell me, what would you have done if someone used a master key on your door?